We like to think we know what unemployment is, but you may find through this lecture that your definition of unemployment and the government's definition of unemployment are two different things. So let's get to it. You would think, of course I know what unemployment is. It's when someone doesn't have a job. Well, yes, technically it's when somebody doesn't have a job. But when we really are looking at this within the economy, we tend to divide it into two very broad categories. Now, the first one is cyclical unemployment. Now, I have a hard time saying that, especially saying it often. So I'm going to call it short run. With the short run sort of cyclical unemployment, I can't do Peter Piper either. What we're finding is that you're looking at situations in which something has occurred in the economy. It could be regionally, it could be nationally, it could be by state, that has caused short-term unemployment. I live in Florida. We have hurricanes. If a hurricane comes through and beats up some businesses and sort of destroys them, then those people may become unemployed. That region of Florida may have a lot of unemployment in the short run until the businesses can be rebuilt and people can be rehired. In other regions of the United States, the actual business is all dependent on the temperature. So if I'm up in a ski area, we might see unemployment that fluctuates because of seasonal unemployment. And so you'll hear those words also. We're not going to be really looking at that type of short-term cyclical unemployment in this particular video. We're really going to focus on natural rates of unemployment, which I can say much easier, so I'm happy. The natural rate of unemployment is basically what we see from year to year. And we do tend to look at a broader time scale year to year. And good economies, healthy economies should have some unemployment. And that may seem a bit counterintuitive, but if you think about it, you want to be able to have people who can leave a job voluntarily. They want to leave employment for a while. So perhaps somebody who has a sick parent, they'd like to know that they can leave unemployment. They can leave employment for a while. They can become unemployed, take care of that parent, and then later on go back into the workforce. Or perhaps somebody who has decided to have a job for a while and now they want to go back to college, and so they're going to become a full-time student, so they're going to be unemployed for a while and then they're going to learn to return back to the workforce. But you have sort of a choice because there's enough jobs out there that you know you can return to one. With full employment, quite often what we're seeing is people are afraid to leave their employment because they don't think they can get another job. So we're going to look at natural rates of unemployment for this particular chapter, because if we understand what natural rates of unemployment are, then we can spot sort of that short-term unemployment, the unusual unemployment. But there are sort of two questions we need to answer early on in this lecture. One is, how does the Bureau of Labor and Statistics actually measure unemployment in an economy? So you see a chart here. This is a real chart that they put out, and you'll see that we have different unemployment rates across time. But what's nice about this chart is that you also see the recessions. And so you can see pretty much anytime there was a recession, there was higher unemployment rates. And so this helps us begin to understand some things, but at the same point, what are the issues with looking and interpreting this data? And there is real issues with looking and interpreting the data. So let's get to it. Let's first kind of understand how unemployment is actually measured. Going straight to the department that calculates unemployment for the United States, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the question is always, how do they do this? Well, they have this current population survey. You can see they do about 60,000 households, and they're really looking at what have you done in this last month. Now, this is really a good website to go to, and I've put the URL right there if you really want to understand more about how the process works. But let's talk a little bit what else they've posted in that site, and I will tell you what you see on this slide coming up all comes directly from them. So first of all, what is a labor force? Well, according to their definition, a labor force is basically all the employed and unemployed people. Now, employed people are pretty easy to figure out, right? Because they're the people who have jobs. Well, again, technically, we have to look at what a job is. So if you have a kid who's working 20 hours a week, they're over 16. Now, 16 is sort of that cutoff age. They have to be 16 or older. And they're working on there for free. But they have 20 hours worth of work that they do each week. So, hey, son, if you want me to pay for your college, you go, feed the hens or dig up whatever this is, they will be considered to be employed even though they're not receiving a wage. Same with perhaps a spouse who goes and works at the family dentist office, goes in for 2 or 3 days a week and is doing the bookkeeping. They're doing 20 hours worth of work. They will be considered part of the employed. They will be part of the labor market. So these unpaid family workers actually add up to a lot more than you think as far as people within the employed ranks, but they're not physically getting any money. The reason is the feeling is that they are contributing to a business and it's a family business, and so they're getting paid basically through the profits of that business. Now, what about people who are unemployed? Well, first of all, of course, they have to be jobless, but they also must be actively looking for jobs sometime in the last 4 weeks. They also have to be available for work. Now, available for work is kind of an interesting one because, well, let's say that I fell down and broke my leg, I broke a femur. I'm going to be basically unavailable for work for a couple of weeks, so I would not be considered to be unemployed because I wasn't available to work. And there's some interesting twists when we look at this and we start looking at the whole unemployment thing. But understand, if somebody isn't available for work, they're not part of basically the labor force because they're not employed and they're not unemployed. And if I haven't actively been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks, so I got laid off, but I decide, I'm going to go take a month to chill and then start looking, that month that I took off for not looking for a job, I am not considered to be unemployed. I am not part of the labor force because I wasn't available for work. So what about if I go to, let's say, a job training that takes a month? Or, I'm sitting home and I'm just reading about jobs. Am I unemployed? And the answer is no, because you're not actively seeking work. So you're not counted as unemployed. There are also other people who are not counted as part of the labor force, and those would be people who live in institutions, so correctional prisoners, not considered to be unemployed. But also, interestingly, active duty armed forces is not considered to be part of the employed or unemployed. They're just not part of the labor market at all, so they're not counted. So if we call a household where there's a military person there, they're not counted. But understand that employed is anybody who does even any part-time work or even temporary work. So somebody hires you in for 3 days to do some work, you are considered to be employed. This is one reason why a lot of part-time people or temporary jobs may go unpaid or unfilled, you might want to say, because basically the amount of money they would get for that small job is not enough for them to give up their unemployment benefits. So they'd be considered to be employed, and then they would lose their benefits. And so they would rather wait to find a full-time job or a non-temporary job that they could earn a living for a long period of time rather than this short period of time. So once unemployment begins to run out, that's when you'll see individuals who are sort of on the edge of unemployment to unemployment compensations to start perhaps taking part-time or temporary work. Now, there's also this group called the marginally attached. Now, marginally attached are not counted as unemployed. They're not counted as unemployed because they're not really currently looking for work, but they've demonstrated some sort of desire to be part of the labor force. So maybe, a couple of months ago I applied for this and a couple of months ago I applied for that, and I am kind of going to a job training program, or I've decided to go back to school. They're called marginally attached because they still have some degree that they want to be part of the labor force and they're looking to be part of the labor force, but they're not actively looking for jobs. So they are not counted as basically unemployed, and they're not counted as employed. Basically, they're not counted as part of the labor force. And then we have basically discouraged workers, and they're the ones who've given up. They're not looking for work at all anymore. They've tried, there's nothing out there. I'm 62 years old. I'm never going to get another job again. They're all going to think I'm too old. And so they're sort of biding their time perhaps until they can get some retirement money. They're called discouraged workers, and again, they're not counted as unemployed because they're not actively looking for work. So this gives us a sort of a basic rundown of how the Bureau of Labor and Statistics breaks down who is employed, who is unemployed, but more importantly, what the labor force is. So we're just going to look at a few more things from them and then we'll move on. So this is probably about how you're feeling right now about this information, and let me give you some more exciting information, like how to actually calculate this stuff. So labor force is pretty easy. Unemployment rate, we like to multiply by 100 because, well, let's face it, we don't like decimals. And of course, then there's this labor force participation rate. And I can see you still feel like the guy at the top. Why? I'm going to transform you because we're not going to hand calculate any of that. We're going to go to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics and we're going to go get their charts. They have tons of great charts. People just go right to the source. Here's an actual shot of many of the different ways you can look at the chart. And if those aren't enough, hey, they have a whole list of charts for you. So no reason to hand calculate any of this stuff. Just go right to the source, click on what you want, and they'll show you a great table of this information. So I said earlier, in a healthy economy, there are always some people who are unemployed. And there are two types of unemployment in this case when we talk about natural rates of unemployment. One is frictional unemployment. And that's basically because we change jobs. And when we change jobs, it could take us time to find a job that's best suited to our knowledge, skills, and ability. Well, why are we changing jobs? Well, sectoral shift is sort of a big one that we talk about. One sector within an economy becomes bigger and there are more jobs in that sector, and another sector of the economy or within an industry may go down. So as smartphones began to become more popular, the creation of calculators, not so common because people just use their cell phone to have the calculator on it. So people had to shift from one sector to another. As we go from handmade things to machine-made things, there are just always sectoral shifts that are occurring within basically most economies. Now the other way, it could be what we call structural employment. Now this is where basically we have more people looking for a job than there are jobs available within that sector. Now notice I say within that labor market, because there could be many jobs available within a labor market, but people don't want to take those jobs. One example is that there are many jobs available for people who want to pick fruit, but most people don't want to be fruit pickers. Or we may have a lot of jobs available in engineering, but people aren't looking for those jobs. They'd rather be a lawyer. So that's not what we're talking about. Here we're talking about where there are more people who want a specific job than there are available jobs. And so working with a bunch of young people, I always think about gaming as a great example. There's a lot of people who want to be professional gamers or professional athletes, and the number of jobs that are available in those sectors is very small compared to the number of people who want to do that job. So that would be structural unemployment. There's kind of a saying is that there's really never zero unemployment in an open economy. Now, in a closed economy, they could say that there's zero unemployment. They're making up their numbers. Everybody is doing something. But remember, for us, when we talk about unemployment, we also have very specific parameters of what we consider to be an unemployed person. So a housewife who doesn't have a job isn't considered to be an unemployed person, even though that housewife or that house husband or whoever it is who's staying home and taking care of the kids and cleaning the house is working, and they're working their little butt off. They're not considered to be employed. One thing that I haven't really talked too much about, primarily because I don't know exactly when you're going to be seeing this, is the pandemic effect of unemployment. Now, I bring this chart up because one of the things that I liked about this chart was that it's showing you two things. One is it's showing you basically what the unemployment rate is. And you can see that we have the Great Recession here of 2008. And then you can see this really huge incline right here of unemployed people when the pandemic hits. So we have really not been up at this range of unemployment. So this is, of course, sort of a scary thing to happen within the society. But the thing that is also interesting about this one is that this is basically the number of unemployed person per job opening. So how many people per job opening is there unemployed? And you'll notice that one of the things that's interesting is that the gap between here and here is basically the same as you go down until we get to the pandemic. And then look at the difference in the gap between the number of unemployed per job opening and the unemployment rate. So this is still playing out. I don't feel comfortable talking about how everything's going to happen because it's in real time. History usually helps us understand these things. And since we don't have a historical period that looked like this, I don't have any references to really go back to that. So you might say economists are playing a little bit by ear to look at unemployment and how this is going to affect our overall economy. Hopefully by the time you are listening to this, though, a lot of this has been worked out. We're going to look at minimum wage laws and how they affect structural unemployment. I've already done a major lecture on unemployment and how that chart over here was created, so you might need to go back to that if you need. But just kind of a couple of things to remember. This is a binding price because here's where our equilibrium point is, where supply and demand is. But if we put a minimum wage law in, we basically have a binding price, and that binding price is going to affect basically supply and demand. So with this binding price or this price floor, what's going to happen is that we're going to find that there's going to be more supply than there is basically jobs. And this tends to affect our least skilled and least experienced people in the labor market. Now remember, this is the point where both people and employers are sort of looking to hire people with the least amount of experience, least amount of skill in the labor market. But when we put that binding price in, we've moved it up. We said this is the least that it can be. So now we're willing to supply a lot more labor, but being more expensive, the employer may not have as many jobs. So this gap between here and here, this is basically our unemployment. So it's our labor surplus. We've got more workers than we have jobs. And remember, structural unemployment is more workers than there are jobs. So with a minimum wage, we can see that. But it is not the predominant cause of unemployment, understand, because it affects just a very small group of people. And when we start talking about that it affects only a small group of people, it's not going to affect those people who have jobs that are above minimum wage. Those who are making, anywhere above minimum wage, they've already come to an equilibrium point in the job market. Basically, if I'm an engineer, there is an equilibrium point that has been created between the supply of people who will go into that field and the number of jobs that are out there. So if a wage is kept above minimum level for basically any reason, the result is not unemployment. That's why we say that minimum wage laws is not the predominant cause of unemployment, because to be honest, most jobs pay above minimum wage. There is, though, basically big debates, you might want to say, on whether or not minimum wage laws affect or don't affect and what should or shouldn't be done. And again, we addressed those issues in an earlier lecture, so if you've forgotten some of those, go ahead and go back and take a look at that. Let's take a look at our next thing that affects unemployment. Unions probably were at their height in the United States around the 1940s and 50s, where about a third of people who worked in a workplace were part of a union. Now, in Europe, unions are much stronger. You can see 50% of the population being in unions. But because unions have really fallen off, we're looking at somewhere between 12 to as low as 9% of the population of workers, labor force now being in unions. Let's cover a few things about them to make sure we know what they are. First of all, labor unions, they're quite often referred to as cartels because a cartel is an organized group of people. Labor unions are the same thing. They do tend to be divided up, though, by trades or industries. And of course, one of the largest unions in the United States is the AFL-CIO, which is basically a collection of unions. So quite often one union will support another union in activities. So what are they doing? Well, first of all, what unions' biggest purpose is basically collective bargaining. And collective bargaining is basically where the union and union representatives are going to negotiate with the employer about things like wages, benefits, working conditions, even things like getting fired and grievances. So they're basically representing workers and saying, here's what we expect from management, and here's what we're willing to do. Collective bargaining is a system of negotiations that has been around for a long time. Now, if the collective bargaining doesn't go through and you're in a unionized shop, then basically you can call for what's called an official strike. Now, understand there's official and there are unofficial strikes. Unofficial strikes are not protected. Official strikes are protected. Basically, with an official strike, we have to have the whole union vote that they will strike. And if they don't vote to strike, if the majority doesn't, then it could be an unofficial strike. But in an official strike, the unions will vote. Now, these were really, really powerful back in the day when we had so many people who were members of unions. And you might say, why did we really need them? Well, what working conditions were in the 30s and the 40s is nothing like the working conditions today. And you really had people literally dying on the lines because they couldn't take a day off, or they didn't have any medical care, or even pay was terrible. Lots and lots of riots and violence that was held between management and the strikers and the union people. There was really big deals in the 30s and the 40s in this era. Today we still have strikes, and down there at the bottom you see three rather prominent strikes that we've had not too long ago. The Writers Guild of America, I can remember when they went on strike, and TV shows weren't allowed to produce new material. Basically, writers were on strike, they wouldn't write new things, and they would be recycling old scripts for shows and sort of trying to redo them or showing old shows. The second one is a picture from a very popular strike that the American people supported, and that was people who basically protested UPS because they had this system of not giving people full-time hours and keeping them part-time for years. They'd give them like one less hour than they needed to be full-time. And nurses, have gone on strike in many places where they feel like not only are they not being paid well, but the working conditions aren't good, and it may not be good for their patients. So strikes are still a pretty common thing out there, but we are looking at like official strikes. And then we also want to understand that all of this comes about again, around the 1930s. The National Labor Relations Act is what really starts basically the okay for unions. Because the truth is that generally we don't allow this type of activity among employers, that they could become a cartel. We decided as a country that it was okay to allow individuals, workers, to basically unionize in order to give them some power against the employer. And so that act comes in. Now, there's been lots of acts since then that have come in, and if you take a law class, if you're a business major, I should restate this. If you're a business major, you're going to be taking law classes. If you're not a business major and you do decide one day to own your own business, please make sure that you do understand what the laws are around unions and non-unions. Because in many countries, or in many states, we also have these right to work laws. Now, what you're seeing coming up here is basically a picture of those states that have right to work laws and those states that don't. In Florida, we are a right to work law. And that basically says is that you can't be forced to join a union if there's a union at your place of business. And also that not all unions are legal. So one of the most famous ones is when the air controllers went out on strike, and President Reagan said, you've got to go back to work because this is not a legal union. And if you don't go back to work, I'm going to fire you. And he fired them. And that union was dissolved because it did not fit underneath the laws of what can and can't be a union. So, we do have a lot of laws around this. And in a right to work state, by the way, all it says is that I can't compel you to join the union in order to get a job. Whereas in not right to work states, so like Alaska or California, if you went to work in a union place, so um, I'll just make up Waka Waka factory here, and they had a union, you would be required to join that union if you were a person who had what they call a union job. You would join the union, you would pay the fees, you'd pay the dues, and that union would represent you in negotiations. We're in a right to work state. We're saying you have a choice to or not to join a union. So teachers unions are pretty common around the United States. And so as an instructor, if there was a union at my particular place, I would have the right to join it or not to join it. Now, if I don't join it, then I don't get all the benefits of it. So that's where people have to make decisions. But in right to work states, it was decided that the individual should have that decision. Now, that can be good and that can be bad for the individual. It's great for the individual because I can decide if I do or don't want to join it, but it also loses some of the power of the union because not everybody joins the union, especially people who are just starting out in jobs, people who are just coming into a new job. Quite often their salaries are at the lower end because they are the new ones and they don't want to pay union dues, to be honest. And so you may have very low level of people who are, or amount of people who are in a union, thus not giving the union the power of the voice of the people, you might want to say. As far as economists are concerned, basically, there's pros and there's cons against unions. I mean, critics will basically argue that because this is a type of cartel, that unions can artificially raise wages, and that in an artificial raising of wages, beyond what basically the marketplace would have, what's going to do is lead to that unemployment, because basically they create like a type of minimum wage. And when we have a type of minimum wage, we have a number of people who want a job and a number of people who won't have the job. And so with a surplus of labor, what quite often happens is that you have people waiting to get a specific job. Now, the other argument on that is that may be true, that you have a specific number of people waiting to get this job and they're over there in Nebraska working, but if they can't get that job and they have all the skills, then they should be able to go to something like Colorado or Arizona. And if they're in a union, then especially if they're in Nebraska, their union may be able to find them a job in Arizona and they can move that basic skill set to another union job, and the union can help them basically find that location. But the problem is then you would have to move, and so people don't like to do that. This particular class is not about whether or not we should or shouldn't have unions, but to understand that unions can cause structural unemployment in the same way that a minimum wage law can cause structural unemployment. So there's one more to look at, and let's move on. The last one we're going to talk on is this theory called efficiency wages. Now, the theory of efficiency wages basically says we're going to increase wages to a level where we feel that there's going to be an increase in productivity because workers are going to feel more motivated. So the basic premise is that you have productivity on one side and enthusiasm on the bottom, and that as productivity goes up, so does enthusiasm. As enthusiasm goes up, so does productivity, and people will be more enthusiastic to take a job where there's perhaps a higher wage than a job that there isn't a higher wage. And so if we take this basic model and we sort of put it into supply and demand, it's going to look like this. And you might say, but that's minimum wage. And it basically is. It is a type of minimum wage, except for now we're calling it an efficiency wage. Because this is the point where right now most companies are paying, let's say, and we can use engineers as a great example for this type of thing. Maybe right now most companies are saying, hey, the equilibrium wage and equilibrium point is here, but I think in order for me to have happy engineers, I'm going to pay at this price. And so I've got a binding price. That's the least that I'm going to pay for, which means we're going to have an efficiency wage, which means more people want to be engineers, and there's going to be more labor than there is going to be demand. So if we put this together, then the question is why we want to do this. Well, there's some key assumptions that go along with efficiency wages. And those key assumptions basically say that, it's expensive for turnovers, it's expensive to hire people, that people will be more motivated, they'll be more of what they call bonded to their job if we have people who are satisfied with their job because of this higher wage that they're getting. And we also can talk about what we call the cream of the crop, meaning is that you tend to feel that you're going to have better workers, you're going to have the more motivated workers, you're going to have the ones who have higher skill levels because they're going to be the ones who want that job. And the ones with lower skill levels, well, you can let those people go because there's going to be plenty of other people who want the job. So you can keep looking for the best of the best, you might want to say. So it leads also to structural unemployment because basically more people want the job, but you don't have as many jobs. So it's kind of interesting. So those are the three that we really talked about as far as different types of structural unemployment. Let's kind of move on to the end here. If you'd like to find out how that minimum wage chart that you see above you was created and perhaps understand a few more pieces of it, please make sure you go to the Supply, Demand, and Government Policy lecture in my economics playlist. Until next time, keep learning.